Do you view the older members of your church as a blessing or as a drain on resources? Do you look ruefully at your ageing congregation and wish your seats were filled with younger people? Or when you look at the older folk that God has appointed you to lead and to serve, is your heart filled with love and with gratitude for the honour and privilege of doing that? I really hope it's the latter, because our churches should be a great place to grow old. I'm Tina English, and I'm the founder and director of a Christian charity called Embracing Age, and I want to just take some time today to look at how and why the church should be a great place to grow old. So let's start by looking at Zechariah. In Zechariah 8 verses 4 to 5, it says this, and I'm reading from the Message version. Old men and old women will come back to Jerusalem, sit on benches on the streets and spin tales, move around safely with their canes. A good city to grow old in. And boys and girls will fill the public parks laughing and playing. A good city to grow up in. Now, Jerusalem is often seen as a type of the church in the Bible, and I want to suggest that this is what the church should be like. A good place to grow up in and a good place to grow old in. You know, in recent years there's been perhaps a focus on the church being a good place to grow up in, with a focus on the developing of youth and children's ministries, and of course they're all very valid, but I want us to consider, what does it mean for the church to be a good place to grow old in? And it's important to consider this because we're living in times of an ageing population. And it's not just our church congregations that are ageing, it's a global phenomenon. The population is ageing across the world. So to give you some stats for the UK, between 2012 and 2017, the number of people living to be 100 increased by 85%. By 2030, it's predicted that 1 in 5 people will be aged over 65. Now, the over 85s are the fastest growing age group, and it's forecast to double in the next 20 years. The church is actually ageing more quickly than the rest of society. In 2000, the over 65s accounted for 25% of congregation members, and this has steadily grown so that by 2030 it's predicted that 45% of churchgoers will be aged over 65. And in line with the rest of society, the over 85s is the fastest growing age group. It accounted for just 5% of the over 65 congregation at the start of the millennium, and it's predicted to rise by 19% by 2030. How are you planning for that as a church? What is your mission strategy to older people? Of course we want to encourage younger people back into church life as well. I've got 3 children in that age category, and it's vitally important that we do that, but that's not enough of itself because our congregation and our population is ageing, and so we need to consider what our mission strategy is to older people as well, so that our churches are good places to grow old in. So this begs the question, what do we mean by old? Now, your definition of old probably depends on how old you are. I once watched a television programme where they asked a 4-year-old how old is really old, and that 4-year-old said 30. So by her definitions, I'm completely ancient. I think one of the best definitions I've heard is from a retired member of our congregation who said that old is 10 years older than me, and I love that definition because it just shows you how relative age is. One thing that can be helpful is to think in terms of the 3rd and the 4th age of life. The 3rd age is what we might call actively retired people who have retired but they're living independently. And then the 4th age of life is for people who are retired but have become frailer. They may have physical, cognitive disabilities, and their ability to live independently is limited. Now, as a nurse, I worked at a day hospital, and I had the privilege of looking after a 96-year-old lady who had come in because her legs were swollen. Now, this lady used to ride her horse every day in Hyde Park, and so having swollen legs was proving particularly inconvenient because she couldn't put her riding boots on. So we were able to sort out her swollen legs, and she went back on her horse riding in Hyde Park. Now, at 96, she is clearly still in the third age of life by the definition I've just given you. But you could contrast that with perhaps somebody who's in their 60s or early 70s who's perhaps housebound due to disability. What I like about thinking about the third and fourth age is that it takes the numbers out of the equation. But like any classification, we've got to be careful, and it is limited. And actually, the different categories can be quite fluid, because you could be generally in the third age of life, but then a period of illness could take you into the fourth age, then you could go back to the third age again. But it can be helpful just to think beyond the numbers. All too often we clump older people together in a homogenous group, when in reality the over 65 actually comprise quite a number of different generations. Now, you wouldn't consider putting a 2-year-old in the same generation as, say, a 22-year-old. And yet we so easily just put a 68-year-old in the same category as an 88-year-old. So we need to be mindful that when we're talking about older people, we're actually spanning quite a few generations. People have had different life experiences. I asked my mum and dad, they're in their mid-70s, and I asked them if they would consider themselves seniors. And they were quite put out by it and said, certainly not. So I said, well, how would you label yourself if you had to give yourself a label? And my mum said, well, I think I'm young at heart. I wouldn't mind being labelled like that. And my dad said, well, I'd just say I was in my 70s. So I said, okay. I said, what about if we labelled you actively retired? How would you feel about that? And they were actually both quite okay with that. They said, yeah, that's okay. If we had to have a label, that's an okay one. Although my dad did jokingly say he'd rather be inactive and retired, but Mum won't let him. But, we do need to think about these labels and these categorisations when we're thinking about our ministry amongst older people, because how we label older people and how we view older people will shape whether the church is a great place to grow old in. There can be a temptation to view people who are in the fourth age of life, who are less able to live independently, as of less value, as if our value and our worth is based on what we contribute and what we can give. And in fact, there's also a temptation to value people in the third age of life for what they can give as well. We see them as rota fodder. We do like to fill up slots on our rotas in churches, and we view people who are actively retired as able to fill up some of those slots. And actually both of those things aren't great, because in both situations we are valuing people for what they can do rather than for who they are. I don't know whether you've ever been in a situation where you have felt that people just want you for what you can give them and what you can do for them. It's actually really disheartening and, to be honest, quite soul destroying and exhausting as well. Our value isn't based on what we give or what we contribute. So what is our worth and our value based on? Fortunately, the Bible gives us some answers, and this morning I want to think briefly about 4 things that our worth as human beings is based on. And they're things that never change, no matter how young or how old we are. Now, I just want to credit John Swinton for some of this that he writes in a book about dementia, Living in the Memories of God. I've taken what he'd written and adapted it. So there's 4 things that as individuals we are. Firstly, we're dependent. Secondly, we're created in the image of God. Thirdly, we're loved. And then fourthly, we're created for relationship. We're relational beings. So we're going to look at each one of those things for a little while. First of all, we are dependent. You know what? We place so much value on independence in our society today. But actually, God has created us for dependence as human beings. And this is really challenging. We're meant to be dependent on Him, and we're actually meant to be dependent on one another. John Stott, who's a famous Christian theologian, when he was in his 80s, he had a period of ill health and he fell and he fractured his hip. And so for a season he was dependent on other people. And this is what he wrote. We come into this world totally dependent on the love, care and protection of others. We go through a phase of life when other people are dependent on us. And most of us will go out of this world totally dependent on the love and care of others. And this is not an evil, destructive reality. It is part of the design, part of the physical nature God has given us. I sometimes hear old people, including Christian people who ought to know better, say, I don't want to be a burden on anyone else. I'm happy to carry on living so long as I can look after myself. But as soon as I become a burden, I would rather die. But this is wrong. We are all designed to be a burden to others. You are designed to be a burden to me, and I am designed to be a burden to you. And the life of the family, including the life of the local church family, should be one of mutual burdensomeness. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ, it says in Galatians. Christ himself takes on the dignity of dependence. He is born a baby, totally dependent on the care of his mother. He needs to be fed. He needs his bottom to be wiped. He needs to be propped up when he rolls over. And yet he never loses his divine dignity. And at the end, on the cross, he again becomes totally dependent. Limbs pierced and stretched, unable to move. So, in the person of Christ, we learn that dependence cannot deprive a person of their dignity, of their supreme worth. And if dependence was appropriate for the God of the universe, it is certainly appropriate for us. Such challenging words there from John Stott. We are designed for dependence. And you know, Jesus modelled this with his disciples. When he sent out the 12, he said to them, take nothing with you. Now, I'd always presumed that meant that they were then to be dependent on God. And yes, that is true to a certain extent, but also they were meant to be dependent on others, because he says to them, when you enter a house, stay there. They're having to be dependent on other people as well as dependent on God. So we are designed for dependence. That's the first thing. And then we're created in the image of God. It tells us in Genesis 1, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And in Genesis 2 it says, the Lord formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being. You know, we have the breath of God in us. We're made in the image of God. And that's one of the reasons Jesus could say, when whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And our identity flows from this. We are sons and daughters of the King of Kings. You've probably heard the saying, I think, therefore I am. But actually, that's not true at all. Because our reason for being isn't our cognitive ability or our physical ability for that matter. What if my cognitive ability is impaired and I can't think clearly anymore? Am I of less value? Am I less of a person? No, because I'm a daughter of the King of Kings. God has breathed his life into me. Therefore I am. And you are sons and daughters of the King of Kings. And that's an identity that's built on a solid foundation. It's never going to change. People in the fourth age of life are sons and daughters of the King of Kings. And this leads me to my third point. As human beings, we are loved. We're loved deeply, far more than we could ever imagine. I'm loved, you're loved. People in the third and fourth age of lives are deeply loved. The Apostle John, towards the end of his life, keeps coming back to the love of God. After everything that he's seen and experienced, he's been with Jesus, he's seen all the miracles, he's seen amazing things, and yet all the time he just keeps coming back to the love of God. And he says this, he says, see what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. If you take nothing else from this seminar other than a renewed sense of how loved you are, you'll be empowered to change the world. Because we're not loved for anything that we've done, that we haven't done, that we can do, that we can't do. We're loved. Full stop. God doesn't love us because we love and serve him. He initiated. He reached out in love to us. It tells us in Romans that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Now, I know these are really basic truths, but sometimes after we've been a Christian for a little while, they're really easy to forget. We slip into performance mode and it becomes about what we do. I haven't read my Bible enough, I haven't prayed enough, I haven't shared the gospel enough, I haven't been holy enough. And we start to feel bad, or it can swing to the other extreme. We start feeling, yay, I'm such a good person, I've been reading my Bible, I've been praying, go me. And you know what? Both of those things are wrong. And they actually, both mindsets end up distancing us from God, because it was never about our performance. Think about a baby in its mother's arms. That baby doesn't have to do anything. It is loved. Yes, as it grows up, it's going to have to learn to do things. It will learn how to walk, it will learn how to use a potty, etc., etc. But the mother's love for it isn't based on them doing those things. A mother loves that baby anyway. The mother's love is always unconditional, and as parents, our love is always imperfect, and yet God's love is perfect. It's even more powerful than that. And Romans goes on to tell us that nothing can separate us from the love of God, neither famine, nor hardship, nor powers, nor the present, nor the future, height, nor depth, nor anything in all creation. And within that we could include not dementia, not frailty, can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. So we're dependent, we're created in the image of God, we are loved, and finally we are relational. Human beings are created for relationship, and perhaps that's one of the things that has been brought home so clearly during this pandemic and during the lockdown. We realise we're meant to be with others, we're not meant to be locked down at home, we're not meant to be unable to hug people. We're created for relationship. Genesis tells us that it's not good for man to be alone. At the beginning of time, God said it's not good for man to be alone. We're created for relationship with God and with one another, to love and to be loved. And we only have to look at the effects of loneliness in society today to realise how true that is. Loneliness can affect us at any stage of life, and again I think we've seen that more so in this pandemic. But I think people in the fourth stage of life are perhaps more vulnerable and more at risk of loneliness because they may experience so much loss. They can lose friends, they can lose family through people dying, they can lose their health, their mobility, and all those things shrink their social world. And there's a statistic from Age UK, and this is a statistic that came before the pandemic, so it'll be interesting to see how much it's increased since then. That 49% of older people say that the TV or pets are their main companion. That's nearly half of older people experiencing that loneliness. We're not designed to be alone, we're designed for relationship. And all these 4 truths remain constant throughout our lives. We're dependent, we're created in the image of God, we're loved, and we're relational. A frail old lady in a care home with dementia is still created in the image of God, is still loved, and is still in need of relationship. So how does this translate into practice? How do these truths translate into our ministry amongst older people? I think they're the foundation on which any ministry amongst older people can be built, because the way we view older people will affect whether the church is a great place to grow old in. And I think viewing and valuing older people in the way that God views and values them distinguishes us from the rest of the world, and it provides motivation to action. So I want to suggest very briefly 3 actions that can come out of this foundation of how we view older people. And they're very simple, and I'm just going to be very quick on this. It's to look, listen and love. We need to be intentional in looking for older people, both in our congregation and in the wider community, and more so now than ever, because many are shut behind closed doors, scared to go out. Even if we were meeting on a Sunday morning, not all our older people are going to be there. There's older people in care homes who are very much overlooked and ignored by society, and there's people who are carers who can't get out. So let's be intentional about looking, where are the older people that we're trying to reach out to? And then secondly, listen. Don't assume, first of all, that older people are needy, because not all older people are needy. And secondly, let's not assume what their needs are. Let's not think, I want to start this ministry amongst older people because I think blah blah blah. Let's first of all take a step back. Let's listen to what older people have to say. There's so much we can learn from older people and from their wisdom, and if they do have needs, let them tell us what those needs are and how we can help meet those needs. So looking and listening are the first 2 really important steps before we go charging ahead with something new. And then finally, love. Love is expressed in word and in action. It's practical. And we don't have time to go into lots of practical examples this morning, but it could be as simple as sitting with an older person for an hour having a cup of tea. It could be helping them with their shopping. It could be perhaps, when things improve and we're allowed to do this, giving them a lift to church. Or it could be sitting with somebody with dementia during a church service, just to make sure that they don't get agitated, or helping them if they do get agitated. There's so many things that we can do. It could be starting computer classes for older people to help them get more online. Again, we've seen through this whole pandemic just how important it is to be online. So we need to love in our deeds, but also in our words, encouraging older people that they're loved, that they're created in the image of God, even into the 4th age of life, that actually they're not a burden. And if they are a burden, it's a privilege to walk alongside them and help carry their burdens. And as we offer unconditional love to those society has overlooked and ignored, we're actually a powerful prophetic picture of God's love, God's unconditional love, because we're loving not for what we get in return, but we're loving because people are created in the image of God, because they have intrinsic value and worth. How did Jesus say that the world would know that we are his disciples? It wasn't by what amazing meetings we had wasn't by how much we prayed or how much we shared the gospel. Actually, it was how much we loved one another. Love is so important. So, the church should be a great place to grow old. And in order for the church to be a great place to grow old, we need to consider how we are viewing and valuing older people amongst us. Are we recognising that they are dependent just as we're all dependent? Are we recognising that they're created in the image of God, that they're loved by Him, and that they are relational? And how is that affecting then how we minister to older people? Are we looking and listening before we go forward in our ministry? And are we coming alongside and loving older people? I haven't been able to give many practical examples of different things you can do in older people's ministry today, because I wanted to lay that foundation. I've actually got a book coming out in January, which if you are interested, it's called A Great Place to Grow Old, and actually that will give lots of practical examples and tried and tested ways that we can come alongside older people, both in our church and in our older community.
Nothing beats sitting on it, hearing it, tasting it, wearing it, handling it, trying it, comparing it.
The copier produces 1,000 copies for £4. The Riso digital printer produces 1,000 copies for £1.20 at 140 pages per minute.
Discussing it.
The interesting thing about this centre is it's a very difficult breed on a very small site.
Buying it. Recommending it. I definitely recommend it.
It's always good to have resources, and this is very resourceful, so it's a great place to be.
Nothing beats being here. Buy your tickets online now. creonline.co.uk/tickets.